Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask by Anton Treuer. Narrated by Kaipo Schwab. Introduction. Ambassador. Be who you are and say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind. Attributed to Dr. Seuss. Indians. They're so often imagined, but so infrequently well understood. I grew up in a borderland. My family moved a couple times, but we usually lived on or near the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. I went to school in the nearby town of Bemidji, with plenty of other native kids and many more whites. The town's racial composition has changed a lot since then, but in the 1970s and 1980s, it was all whites and Indians. Although the town is surrounded by the three largest reservations in Minnesota, in geographic size and population, the two worlds rarely interacted. The school took kids on field trips to Minneapolis, 225 miles away, rather than to the neighboring native communities. But Indians could be terrifying to members of the white community, and when presented with angry looks and few opportunities to safely learn about their neighbors and the first people of the land, they usually just stuck to their imaginings. That borderland I grew up in was more than an awkward physical nexus of races and communities. It was a divided and confusing place politically, legally, intellectually, and culturally. The tribes maintained their own governments and rarely got involved in the American political process, especially at the local level. And no outsider ever felt like he or she had any authority to ask about, much less comment on or participate in, anything happening on the res. The web of contradictory jurisdictions and agencies that dealt with criminal affairs and Indian land never made much sense to anyone of any race. Indians hadn't written many books, and school districts and the general public would never open up to Vine Deloria Jr. and the few other radical Indians who had actually managed to get anything in print. Most of the elders on the res had gone to government-run residential boarding schools. Their children, the parental generation of my youth, had developed a serious distrust of the government and educational institutions as a result. Educators and administrators resented the parents' absence at school conferences and the truancy issues for many native students, but nobody talked about the bigger issues, which sat like a giant bear in the corner of the room every time the schools and native families interacted. My family and every one of my uncles and aunts harvested wild rice, snared rabbits, and made maple syrup every year, but most of my non-native peers did not. Although I had several painful experiences with overt racial discrimination as a young person, I had some great friends in high school. I was truly inspired by my history teacher, Thomas Gallarnot, whose lectures and support made a significant contribution to my lifelong interest in education and history. I had encouragement from Marlene Bergstrom in the guidance office, and I was a great student. But the borderland was a bramble on every level. I was tired of the tension, the confusion, and the mean-spirited statements of my peers about drunken Indians. I applied to Princeton University on a whim and surprised everyone, from my peers to my parents, and especially myself when I got in. I had found a way out, or I thought I had. I was looking forward to a breath of fresh air and a respite from the borderland of my youth as much as I was to the challenges of a new stage of life, and those years remain some of my most treasured. But I still had a profoundly well-educated Princetonian ask me, "Where is your tomahawk?" Another time, a woman approached me in the college gymnasium and exclaimed, "You have the most beautiful red skin." I was too flabbergasted to respond. I took a friend to see Dances with Wolves and was told, "Your people have a beautiful culture." My people come from the Great Lakes rather than the plains, and from the modern age rather than the 19th century, but again I had no response. I made many lifelong friends at college, and they supported but also challenged me with questions like, why should Indians have reservations? By my junior year, I realized I had not escaped the borderland. No matter how far I traveled, the haze engulfed everyone I met. Indians were imagined, not understood, and there was a dearth of resources and opportunities to do anything about it. I wanted to come home. Homesick though I was not going to be another statistic by dropping out of school. I toughed it out at college, but started a quest to learn more about myself. I no longer wanted to run from the borderland. I wanted to understand it better and do something to make it easier for others to traverse. While at Princeton, I heard that a Comanche medicine woman named Barrett Eagle Bear was coming to New Jersey from Texas to run sweat lodge ceremonies. Hungry for a taste of home, I drove out to the wooded area where she would conduct her ceremony and found, to my great surprise, over 50 naked white people standing in the woods waiting. One man was holding a staff adorned with a pair of deer antlers and chicken feathers. With great trepidation, I opened the car door. I was immediately approached by a naked white woman, roughly 60 years of age and around 190 pounds. She folded me into a tight embrace, saying, "I'm so sorry for what my people have done to your people." Throughout my life, if I have ever thought or said that I had seen it all, I was soon shown something new. Part of me was furious at what looked like a bunch of white people playing Indian. This was not real. I started to question whether Eagle Bear was even Indian for allowing the charade. Part of me wanted to laugh because anyone who got a hug like that from a naked elder really couldn't do anything else. But as I carefully separated myself from her embrace, I looked at her face. She was filled with genuine remorse, on the verge of tears. Respect was a value deeply embedded in my being from my upbringing and cultural experience. Lines on her face showed the wisdom of age and experience. I couldn't laugh, and I couldn't just yell at her or give her a mean look and drive away. And in a flash, my running from the borderlands and my desire to find a way for others to travel through them brought me an epiphany. I was not just another Indian. No Indian really is. Because we're so often imagined and so infrequently understood, I was, both unfairly and rightly, an ambassador for my people. If the morass of misunderstandings that made growing up native so frustrating for me was ever to be remedied, I would have to do my part to shine some light on the brambles and try to clear a path for others. As that old woman looked up at me, I knew that I was probably the first Indian she had ever met, and, though it wasn't fair to anyone, my reaction would be a testament to the character of my entire race. So I didn't laugh. I didn't rise to anger. I didn't call her out or drive away. I very politely said, "Could you put some clothes on? I would love to talk to you about all of this." She put some clothes on, and we talked. I explained that for ceremonies at home we usually covered up in the presence of others, especially with men and women present. We discussed the ceremony, geography, custom, and practice. We talked about history. I explained my feeling that guilt for whites and anger for Indians were doing nothing to make the world a better place, especially for the people who harbored such emotions, understandable though they are. The secret was to turn anger and guilt into positive action. That's how I learned a few things from an unexpected and unlikely source in the New Jersey woods. I learned something about the borderland. Communication requires a safe space for discourse, an opportunity for genuine connection and authentic, reliable information. And I learned something about myself. When I commit to something, I always go all the way. The decks on my house could withstand an earthquake measuring 6.0 on the Richter scale. I have 9 children. I take my job as role model for my children and ambassador for my people seriously. I don't drink alcohol, not because I am a recovering addict. I have never inhaled anything nor blacked out or vomited from drink, but because I want to send a message to my own people and to others. I want to redefine suppositions about what it means to be native. Abstaining is also important to the people whom I now serve at ceremonies. They are looking for a clean, sober place to heal, relying upon the integrity of the people who help at those ceremonies to provide that environment. I gave up on my early plans of becoming an investment banker or lawyer. I never would have been happy in those roles. Instead, I graduated from Princeton with plans to walk the earth, which I did successfully for several months before I had to take a job. But I dedicated myself to the pursuit of my tribal language, culture, and history. I eventually went to graduate school and entered academia. Through it all, I maintained one foot in the wigwam and one in the ivory tower. But I still see the borderland every day out of my bedroom window. This book is designed as a tool to help all people navigate that space. Above all, I want this work to provide a place for people to get answers. It offers a critical first step to comfortably dispel erroneous imaginings and develop deeper understandings. I have now given hundreds of public lectures on a variety of subjects. This book first emerged as part of the question and answer sessions that followed my presentations. Within these safe spaces, people raised a torrent of questions. Although curricula is constantly under revision in public schools, we still have a long way to go to make it easy for Native and non-Native peoples to learn about Indian history, culture, and current events. A good friend of mine, Michael Muirs, eventually suggested the title of this book as the headline for some of my public lectures. Since then, the appeal of this subject has grown dramatically, bringing me all over the United States and Canada to conduct teacher trainings and give public speeches. Before launching into the substance of the questions and answers that form the guts of this book, I also want to make a major disclaimer. Just as no white person can speak for all white people, I cannot speak for all Indians. It would be unfair to ask, what do all white people think about abortion? Of course there is a diversity of opinion on that subject, and nearly every other important subject you may raise. It is the same for Indians. My experiences have taught me what questions people have about Indians, and I am motivated to pool those questions together here and address them. I write mostly about the Ojibwe, because that is what I know, and in many cases you will gain specific rather than generic answers. But I also provide examples and information about a few of the hundreds of other Indian nations that have populated this continent. Some of the current issues I engage, including subjects of identity, tribal citizenship, casinos, mascots, and cultural revitalization, evoke strong and divergent responses from Native people. I am candidly giving my opinions, and the difference between fact and opinion should be clear to you. But I cannot and do not claim to represent the Native view in this book. My responses reflect only the view of one Native person, and they have to be heard with this understanding. Perhaps, given answers to the questions in this work, you will feel better able to seek out different opinions from other Native people. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this book. I sincerely hope that it will make a contribution to breaking down barriers and advancing understanding of Indians for all people. Terminology. When asked what Indians called North America before Columbus arrived, noted scholar Vine Deloria Jr. simply replied, "Ours." What terms are most appropriate for talking about North America's first people? The word Indian comes from a mistake. On his first voyage to the Americas, Columbus thought the Caribbean was the Indian Ocean, and the people there were Indians. The use of the word and assumptions around it are well documented in Columbus's writings and those of other Spanish officials who accompanied him on the voyage and corresponded with him. Russell Means, Peter Matheson, George Carlin, and a few others have claimed that the word Indian is actually derived from the Spanish phrase una gente indios, people of God. But Columbus never used that phrase in reference to any people in the Americas. Use of the word Indian had nothing to do with the words indios. It was a mislabeling based on Columbus's confusion about where he was when he first arrived in the Americas, and it stuck, even after the mistake was well known in Europe. I use the word Indian in this book intentionally, and with full knowledge of its shortcomings, as a misnomer that gives some people offense. I have no fundamental opposition to what some label as political correctness, and in making decisions about labels, I try to use ones that are respectful but also clear. However, The terms native, indigenous, First Nations person, and aboriginal are often ambiguous, equally problematic, and in some cases more cumbersome. I also find Sherman Alexie's remark resonant. The white man tried to take our land, our sovereignty, and our languages, and he gave us the word Indian. Now he wants to take the word Indian away from us too. Well, he can't have it. As much as possible, we should all use tribal terms of self-reference in writing about each tribe. They are authentic and loaded with empowered meaning. Those words, such as Diné, Ho-Chunk, Dakota, Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe, work at the level of tribal discussion, but they sound ethnocentric to members of other tribes. Regardless of all decisions about labels, however, it is most critically important that we respect one another and create an environment in which it is safe to ask any thoughtful question without fear. The only way to arrive at a deeper understanding is to make it acceptable to ask anything you wanted to know about Indians but were afraid to ask, and get a meaningful answer rather than an angry admonition. What terms are not appropriate for talking about North America's first people? It's important that fear of sounding ignorant or racist does not paralyze communication about Indians. Knowing what terms to use can help ease that fear, but knowing what terms to avoid can be just as important. Most Native people frown on use of the words squaw, brave, and papoose. These are words that create distance, use hurtful cliches to point out difference, and say clearly that those people are not like normal people. Squaw is considered particularly offensive. The true origins of the word are a subject of some debate. Some Indian activists and even scholars have asserted that it is actually a corruption of a Mohawk word for female genitalia, although that theory has been largely debunked by linguist Ives Goddard and others. Others assert that it is derived from the Cree word for woman, isquewo, or its Ojibwe variant, ikwe. Considering its first use by the French, the latter seems more likely. The words in Massachusetts and other Algonquian languages on the Atlantic seaboard are quite similar to Cree and may be the more likely origin of the word's transfer to English. Regardless of origin, however, it has often been used as a negatively value-laden term, and most Native people find it truly insulting. Most special terms for minority women have similar perceptions: negress, Jewess. There is ongoing work to change many place names, Squaw Valley, Squaw Lake, into something less offensive, but those efforts are sometimes met with resistance. What terms are most appropriate for talking about each tribe? Each tribe has its own terms of self-reference. Finding the appropriate labels can be confusing because the tribal terms of self-reference are not necessarily those employed by the U.S. or Canadian governments. Sometimes they're not even the same as the terms used by tribal governments. The Ojibwe are a perfect example of this. The word Chippewa, frequently used in reference to the Ojibwe, especially in the United States, is actually a corruption of Ojibwe. Europeans frequently miss subtleties of Ojibwe pronunciation, hardening sounds and omitting letters. The soft J was written down as ch, and the soft B was written as P. The O was not even written, and the E was written as a short A. There have been numerous alternative spellings, but the term Chippewa was incorporated into the bureaucratic mechanisms of the U.S. government and never changed. Even today, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the agency that deals with Indians, uses Chippewa. Furthermore, the term was formally incorporated into the constitutions of all Ojibwe reservations in America because those documents were drafted by the U.S. government rather than by tribal people. Tribal advocacy for the original term Ojibwe is slowly winning out now, however, as many reservations have officially incorporated it into their tribal names and constitutions, with several notable exceptions. Constitutional reform is cumbersome and contentious at any level of politics, and widely supported terminology change often gets sidelined by other more disputed issues, like tribal enrollment. Ojibwe people today use the term Ojibwe as a tribally specific term for self-reference, Ojibwe only, but also use Anishinaabe to refer to all Indians, Ojibwe, Dakota, and others. The word Anishinaabe is used as commonly as Ojibwe by tribal members in everyday conversation, which has led to some confusion about their distinctions. But Ojibwe is tribally specific, and Anishinaabe is inclusive of all tribes. For most tribes, there's one tribal term of self-reference and one other term, either corrupted from the original or entirely foreign. Such is the case for the people the Spanish call Navajo, but who call themselves Diné. Early European explorers named the tribal groups they saw, often ignoring the people's own names for themselves. This happened for the Ho-Chunk, whom the Ojibwe call Winibigug, meaning people of the muddy water, which the French corrupted into Winnebago. Dialect issues within a tribal group occasionally cause confusion as well. The word Sioux, derived from the Ojibwe term Nadowesiwag, a species of snake, was a code word for enemy, and often frowned upon by Dakota tribal members. The people called Sioux are really comprised of three major language groupings, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, who formed an alliance known as the Ochete-Chacoan, 7 council fires. The Lakota further diversified into 7 more bands, but the Dakota are not the Lakota. Calling them Ochete-Chacoan still leaves outsiders unsure of which group is being discussed, and sometimes scholars and even tribal members use the term Sioux as an expedient way to speak about the entire grouping in spite of the issues with the term. How do I know how to spell all these complicated terms? In discussion of tribes, it is usually best to use the preferred spelling of their respective reservation tribal governments. Sometimes tribal government spellings do not reflect the preferred spellings of tribal members or accepted orthographies, but they are your safest bet. What term is most appropriate? Nation, band, tribe, or reservation? Prior to the first European efforts to colonize Indians, none of these labels were used by Indians to describe themselves, and the peoples of the 2 continents saw the concepts very differently. There was diversity in North America. The Aztec Empire had massive cities and 10 million citizens. Their society was highly structured and perhaps the closest thing to what Europeans recognized as a nation. But the majority of tribes were smaller and simply called themselves the people. In most of the Americas, they lived in villages, and the village was the primary social and political unit in their lives. Even populous tribes like the Ojibwe, who occupied millions of acres of territory, did not function as a single political entity. Villages were autonomous. Today there are around 200 Ojibwe villages, about 2/3 of them in Canada and 1/3 in the United States. But there were even more during the treaty period, and the Ojibwe were one of 500 Indian tribes in North America. Colonial powers, especially the British and Americans, wanted to simplify the politics so they could get at Indian land faster. That process started with the construction of new labels for native communities that in turn helped the evolution of new Indian political structures. So instead of making hundreds of treaties with each and every Ojibwe village, the U.S. government summoned numerous chiefs from many villages in a given area to a treaty conference and called them the chiefs of a certain band. The concept of band was as new as the label to the Ojibwe, but once the political process began, the label and the concept stuck. Even today, the tribal citizenship cards of most Ojibwe people in Minnesota note the band with which they are affiliated: Mississippi, Pillager, Lake Superior, or Pembina, for example. Tribal governments also had the term band incorporated into their constitutions, which were created by the U.S. government, so those political labels permeate the legalese of tribal government today. And often there are 2 to 4 bands represented on each reservation. The concept of band meant a lot at treaty time, and it sometimes plays heavily in land claims cases today. but the label and concept mean little else to Ojibwe people. Many other villages were grouped together under common bands at treaty time when that concept and label did not previously exist. The term is not offensive, but it can be confusing. The word reservation was applied to the lands that were reserved or set aside for various groups of Indians at treaty time. A reservation is the place that many native people call home, and even those who live elsewhere associate strongly with their home reservations. These are the places where most cultural and community events are held, and where tribes spend their resources trying to strengthen their communities and prepare for the future. The word tribe gets used two ways: as a label for all people of the same shared cultural group, as for the Ojibwe and their 200 distinct communities, and also as a label for each reservation's government. Tribes, or tribal governments, are not just cultural enclaves. They are political entities, and complex laws impact and define the scope of their power. Tribes have power that supersedes that of state governments in many ways, making it possible for tribes to operate casinos, for example, without regard for state laws. A detailed explanation of tribal government, sovereignty, and law follows throughout this book, but the labels only make sense when one understands the concepts that inform them. Tribes are, in fact, nations. They make laws, hold elections, administer funds, and interact with other governments. Because tribes are nations, tribal leaders and citizens often emphasize and reinforce their status by use of the word nation, and that term is preferred by some tribal people. The words nation, band, tribe, and reservation are sometimes used interchangeably, and none cause offense, but they all speak to the complicated history and evolving political landscape in Indian country. What does the word powwow mean? A Google search will reveal 2 full pages of definitions and conflicting answers to the linguistic origins of the word. The first usage of the term in English occurred in 1624. Most scholars agree that it is derived from a word in the languages of eastern Algonquian tribes, usually Narragansett or Massachusetts, for spiritual leader. It was later misapplied to many types of ceremonial and secular events that involve dancing, and it has been spelled several different ways. How can I find out the meaning of the place names around me that come from indigenous languages? All languages are composed of roots, and those roots are loaded with meaning. In English, most roots come from the language's Latin, Greek, Celtic, and Germanic underpinnings, usually unknown to everyday speakers of English. But for most first speakers of tribal languages, the roots of words and their deeper meanings are often known. For example, the city of Bemidji, Minnesota, derives its name from an Ojibwe word, Bemidjigamog, meaning the place where the current cuts across, or a river runs through it. That word describes the unique geographical configuration of the place. 4 major watersheds converge and form a continental divide in Bemidji. The Red River watershed flows west and north toward Winnipeg. The Rainy River watershed flows north through the Big Fork River into Rainy River. The Lake Superior watershed flows east, and the Mississippi watershed begins by flowing northwest, pulled toward the Red River watershed, and then north toward the Rainy River watershed. It then flows east toward the Lake Superior watershed before charting its own course southward to the Gulf of Mexico. Bemidji is located on the northernmost point of the Mississippi River. Prior to construction of the power dam on the Mississippi, Lake Bemidji was actually 2 separate lakes connected by a shallow stretch of water off of Diamond Point. The Mississippi River did not flow through those 2 lakes. It simply cut across the corner of the largest one, a very uncommon geographical situation. But the indigenous population that lived in Bemidji had a deep understanding of its geography, of the watersheds pulling at the water from that place, and that understanding is reflected in the name they chose. Most indigenous place names have similar deep meanings. It was very uncommon for a lake or village to be named after a person or another place, as in European naming and mapping conventions. When Europeans developed maps of the Americas, They often tried to use indigenous names for various locales. However, the complexity of the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?